You're just talking to me. It's a casual conversation. So, what's your name?
John Mertens.
And what are your credentials? What is your job?
I teach political science here at King State College.
And have you ever had anything published?
I have had a couple.
What have you had published?
I've had two, scholarly essays published in professional journals, and I've had two op-ed essays published in newspapers.
Okay. So today we're going to be talking about social class. So, how would you define the term social class?
Social class, the way it was taught to me, and the way I think it's easiest to think about it, is a category in society within which movement is easy and typical. And therefore, outside of that category, movement isn't easy and isn't typical. And just so if you wanted to do a two-class society, rich and poor, if you're poor, then moving sort of within the poor group is easy and typical, but moving outside of the poor group into the rich group isn't easy and typical. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so how does one become a part of one of those social groups?
Well, the biggest determinant of that is what you're born into. The biggest determinant of your life chances is what is the circumstances that your parents bring you into the world into. And it's not deterministic, it doesn't mean you're stuck there, but it shapes your opportunities in a lot of different ways.
Okay, and what are those opportunities? What exactly are we talking about?
Well, think about, let's say your parents are, blue collar, depending on how much they make within that category, perhaps we consider them lower middle class or middle class. I'm guessing probably middle class. No college education, work as electricians, or, I played softball with guys that, one of the guys has a service where he takes people's trees out of the ground for them and yanks the stumps out and things like that. Anyway, so those kind of jobs. Well, if you're a child born to parents like that, then that's going to determine some things. I mean, that means, you're going to grow up in a neighborhood probably with other kids from similar backgrounds. It's probably the kind of neighborhood where, so maybe some of the parents have been to college, most of the parents probably haven't been. And a whole bunch of other things we could go into. But then think about
education's one factor, but what are the things that you can point to and say this is a dividing thing? Race,
race gets confused with class a lot, and
so
it's
race
sort of a
has
separate.
No part of social class.
Well, they correlate to each other.
Okay,
but they're different.
They're different, but would you say that race is a part of social classes?
There's an overlap there.
Okay.
White and Asian people tend statistically to be, upper middle, okay. and they tend to be overrepresented in upper middle and higher classes, wealthy class, and
so would you define social classes as more of a statistical rather than a philosophical thing?
I think it has to be both. I mean, I think you have to have sort of a philosophical understanding of the concept at the foundation, and then you've got to try to figure out how you want to measure that in the real world.
So,
and income is what people normally look at, but that only tells part of the story. Like I was talking about with this hypothetical blue-collar family, there are people with those kind of jobs that make a lot of money.
Yes.
So it isn't just about money. It's almost more about mindset and life chances, if you want to think, and the opportunities that are going to be available to you, the path that you're going to be led down.
So to look at the bottom dollar would only be telling a small portion of the story.
It tells some of it, it doesn't tell all of it. There's a lot more going on than that.
But in terms of, so the divisions of social classes, how does a group of people just have one mindset? If it is a mindset thing like you said, how do we then classify people? How does everyone just think the same way?
Well, one of the things that, the sort of body of work that I used when I was doing my dissertation in grad school, a lot of the way they do it is by occupational groupings, which is why I guess I sort of started talking about blue collar and things like that. There are certain kind of categories of jobs that we can look at that people have that is related to how much they make, but it isn't everything in terms of how they make and how they view themselves in social class. And I could probably use myself as an example too. I mean, I teach and I don't make tons of money, but my parents did pretty well. and I'm pretty cognizant of sort of where I fit in society and that kind of thing.
Where do you see yourself fitting in
Well,
society?
it'd be hard for me to make an argument that I'm really anything other than I guess you'd have to say upper middle class, and kind of the lifestyle that I'm used to and the opportunities that are available to me and those kind of things. Certainly not the super wealthy, but my parents had decent jobs, made decent money, and my parents are kind of an interesting story, because when I was born, they didn't have a lot of money. My dad was in the Army, and you probably, if you wanted to classify them in class terms, and this also would fit with how both of them were raised, you'd probably say lower middle class. And my dad was able to use his Army career to to kind of advance himself, and then by the time he retired, I think and my mom ended up being a principal of an elementary school. I think you'd put him pretty solidly in the upper middle class. So that's what I'm used to, and I went to school with people that are like that, and you just get used to seeing the world through a certain lens, based on there's all the kind of cultural references that come with that, and I don't like class barriers, so I try to break them down. And I mentioned my softball team, and I play on a softball team here in Keene, and it is Keene is a pretty blue collar town. I know a lot of guys that do construction and do all those kind of jobs, some of them whom are very successful and make decent money, but they look at the world a certain way, and I can't pretend I'm that. You know what I mean? I get along great with these guys. One of the guys I play softball with, he now owns his own siding company for houses. I get along, but they just look at the world differently than I do, because they've had different parents and been raised in a different environment. I was lucky enough to travel a lot when I was young. You mentioned education. Education is one of the big things, and maybe I can put it to you this way: depending on what kind of class you're born into, your expectations are going to be different. The high school that I went to is actually measured recently as the 8th best public high school in the country. So I come from one of those pretty well off suburban school districts, public school, but that has all the resources, good tax base, everything, and it's not are you going to college, it's where are you going to college. Do you know what I mean? It's just expectation. Everybody's going to college, their parents went to college, their friends are going to college, their brothers and sisters went to college, and you contrast that with the kids of some of the people that I play softball with in Keene, where their parents didn't go to college, and maybe some of their friends are going to go to college and some of their friends aren't. There's a different expectation level. Do you know what I mean? So everything that they're doing between the time that they're born and the time that they're 18, based on this sort of class environment that they're born into, is going to shape how they look at the world, what they think of themselves, what they expect of themselves, what people expect of them, and then because of that, in some ways, what doors are open to them. Now, it doesn't mean they can't change that. Doesn't mean the kids of somebody that I play softball with can't, do really well in school, go to Harvard, and make tons of money, do whatever, and then they're sort of in a different class position. But that wouldn't be typical.
Yes. I'm going to go back to something you said before, and this is sort of spitballing off the top of my head, which you said someone who you play softball with, who you consider blue collar, is actually a small business owner, while you yourself are a teacher for the government. Small business owners, or business owners in general, are usually in a horizontal class view of lower, middle, upper, are usually considered upper, and teachers are usually considered lower. But you consider him blue collar, which I guess to generalize would be considered lower. Would it be fair to say that it's not entirely fair, our view of the world, as a vertical class system, but more of a horizontal class system of cultural differences rather than economic?
That, in an ideal sense, that might be, I would be for that. I don't like all the kind of stigma that comes with class.
What are the horizontal, what is our classical view, and how do we define them?
It depends whether you want to use income or, like I said, use occupation or things like that. And income's pretty self-evident. A lot of people who do this look at fits. They break the income distribution into quintiles, or you could do deciles. The 10% groups or 20% groups. So that's one way you could do it money-wise. I think it's more interesting, like I said, to use kind of income classifications, and I'm probably going to not remember them all right now off the top of my head, but I remember when I was doing my dissertation research, there were 7 that were commonly used, and it was agricultural labor, and then there were farmers, which is sort of the distinction between people who just work there and people who actually own the farms. But then there were also, there was a, I'm trying to think from the kind of top down now, if you will. The wealthiest were, like you were saying, business owners and things like that. But beyond that, there were kind of highly skilled people, but people that still worked for somebody else. Do you know what I mean? People with a lot of education, and in some cases a lot of money, but people that ultimately worked for somebody else. And that's probably what I would fall into, even though I don't make a lot of money. Then there were kind of clerical and sales people, and there were a couple classifications for blue-collar labor, depending on whether you were just a worker or whether you had some management. And I would put my friend, even though he's a business owner, probably in that higher blue-collar category, because he's still fundamentally a blue-collar guy. I mean, he goes out and puts, stuff on the side of houses. That's what he grew up doing, and people he knows are. But so even though he's sort of in management, you could say, because he owns his own business, I don't think that makes him the same as some kind of venture capitalist person. He's just not going to look at the world the same way.
Yes.
He wears camo and he goes fishing and he goes hunting, and that's pretty typical Keaton story.
Is the concept of social class a negative thing?
I would like to say that it's not, but that's what I was saying. I started to get into a minute ago about the ideal world versus the real world. But it is, and some people will argue that class is still sort of the last acceptable form of discrimination, and we do look at people, and I would even say look down on people. And I think that's unfortunate, and it really says something. I think it says something negative about our society that we judge people based on those kind of criteria. But we do. There's a video that maybe you've seen, maybe you haven't, and it might be good for your class as well. It's a documentary. I saw it on PBS a number of years ago now, and it's so good that I actually bought it and I've shown it to my classes. It's called People Like Us, and it's a documentary about social class in America, and it really gets into some good things on this about how it does matter and how we look at it and make judgments on it.
So, is one social class considered better than another?
Well, I think people, and I think this is something that to some extent, I don't know if I want to go so far as to say it's uniquely American, but we certainly take it to a different level. I'll give you a quick example. I heard this story from a friend of a friend of a friend a few years ago about a high school kid that went to Sweden as an exchange student, like I said, in high school. And one of the things they were struck by is at lunchtime, the whole school would meet in the cafeteria. All the students, the principals, the teachers, the janitors, everybody, and they would all just sit and have lunch and talk about what their family was like and what they did for the weekend. And if you think about that in the U.S., you never do that. The president of this college is never going to have lunch with the people who clean the college and cut the grass and stuff like that. We just don't do that in this society. It's stratified. So we certainly have those divisions. Whether we look down upon it or not, a lot of people do. It's unfortunate, but that's the fact of the matter. We do, and it probably ties into this whole American dream thing. We're all aspiring to be better, whatever that means. So therefore, people who aren't doing as well, that's not what we're aspiring to be. So by definition, that gets looked down on.
How do social classes interact?
Well, the unfortunate things, in a lot of ways, they probably don't as much as they should. I mean, people get locked into their little worlds. College is probably one of the really good places where people do come together from a variety of different environments. I mean, you're from New York, and Keene State doesn't have a wide variety geographically. But one of the things I find at this school, once again, I'm not from this part of the world, I'm from California, as I think you know, but one of the things that I've noticed in my few years here is this sort of division between the northern New England kids, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and the southern New England kids, Rhode Island and Connecticut in particular, but then, if you get to the Boston area and something like that, there's a pretty interesting class difference there. Nobody's surprised if they see a Keene State kid driving around in a Beamer or a Saab or whatever. You're probably going to guess it has Connecticut plates. Probably not going to have Vermont plates. It doesn't mean it couldn't, but it's probably not going to. So, there's a class of... Anyway, so my point is that college is, one of the few places still where people come from a variety of environments. They're all stuck together. But even then, you probably notice that people, the preppy kids from Connecticut tend to hang out with other preppy kids from Connecticut, and the kids that wear flannel shirts and like to go mudding and everything from Maine, hang out with kids like that, and so it still breaks down along. College probably not as much. I think people are a little more open and flexible and willing to meet new people and that kind of thing, and have different kinds of friends, but they still put themselves in little groups that are largely class-based. And then when you get out in the real world, then you do it even more, because you're going to, interact with people who are like you, and you don't so much interact with people who aren't like you.
Do we interact in a business sense, or in a financial sense, or in a less discriminatory sense, but more of when we do come together, what happens? I guess the question should be, what happens when we are put next to each other?
I think for a lot of people it can be uncomfortable. They don't know how to interact with people who are from a different class because they have different cultural references. Just to go back to what I was talking about a second ago, the kids from wealthy families in Connecticut are used to different things growing up, not better or worse, but different things growing up than the kids that come from blue-collar families in New Hampshire or Vermont. And once again, in a college setting, that doesn't mean they can't get along, but if you think about outside of college, people interacting, who knows where. I know they meet each other at a wedding or something. It's not like they can't find things to talk about, but in some ways they just don't have the same things in common.
What are some of the struggles facing the bottom social class?
If you want to look at it as poor, then I think you do have to put it in economic terms and just realize that there's a decent chunk of this society for whom financial stability is a struggle, and they worry from month to month about how they're going to pay their bills and feed the family and that kind of thing. And once again, that's very different from what.
Let's stick with what you were talking about. Culturally,
okay.
What is hurting their culture, or what in their culture is hurting them?
I think the stigmatism. Let me put it this way. Let's say, I can kind of tie it back into the college thing. Let's say you got two kids here at Keene State, and one of them comes from I'll go really stereotypical and say some lumberjacking family in Maine, and one of them, and the other one, their family does, say the mom's a lawyer and the dad's like a Wall Street guy, and they live in Connecticut, and kid wants to come up here to college or whatever. All right, now let's say they have the same major here at Keene State, same grades, everything's the same. They come out of Keene State basically with equivalent qualifications. Well, what's going to happen when they go on the job market? And let's assume that they want some sort of business job. I guess what we'd call some entry-level white-collar job, let's say. Well, the kid from Maine, he doesn't have a history of that in his family. Probably doesn't have a lot of people in his family that wear suits to work on a regular basis. Whereas the kid from Connecticut is used to that environment. He's probably had to wear suits to weddings and to various social events, and he's used to interacting with the kind of people that are going to hire him, right? Whereas the kid from Maine isn't. Him or her. I want to be careful not to make this a gender thing either. It's a whole separate issue.
Is gender a part of class?
Well, I mean, there are still sort of statistical overlaps there.
So the same thing with race, where there's overlaps, but you wouldn't want to mix the two.
No. Yeah,
okay.
I would want to keep that separate. I almost think we do ourselves a disservice by mixing both race and gender into the class discussion. But I want to say one more thing real quick on what we were talking about in terms of like the two hypothetical kids going for a job. Even more to the point of who's going to be more comfortable interacting with the people that are going to hire them. One kid's just going to be able to carry on a different conversation than the other based on their backgrounds. And likely the person hiring them is going to have some sort of background similar to the kid from Connecticut. They may have a background similar to the kid from Maine, and that might give the kid from Maine an advantage. But in the grand scheme of things, they're probably going to come from an upper middle class background, and therefore they're going to have things in common. But even more to the point, the kid from Connecticut with the parents in these prestigious jobs can probably open doors for them. They probably play golf and play tennis with people at companies who need to hire people that can get interviews for this kid. Whereas, if your parents are lumberjacks in Maine and you graduate from here with a business degree and you're after, do we even have a business degree? I should probably know this.
We have a managerial degree.
Gotcha. Okay. And so you want to get into, like I said, sort of an entry-level white-collar position. Well, your parents can't open those doors for you because that's not their background. So in all those ways, that's kind of how class perpetuates itself.
What are some of the struggles facing the top social class? What are some of the cultural things there that hurt them?
I don't think there are any other than that people sort of resent them. And you can look at Mitt Romney and people make fun of him and stuff, but that guy hasn't had to struggle a day in his life. And maybe that's being unfair because they have tried to point out, and I'm not trying to make this overly political, he's just somebody who's in the news right now. They have had struggles in their life. His wife, Ann, has had a couple of diseases, MS, I believe, and some things like that. But financially, I don't know how you could say...
But we neglected finances before. Let's look at their culture. What in their culture is possibly hurting them?
I wouldn't want to live that sort of lifestyle just because I find it's very sheltered, and I think that's why he's having a difficult time in the campaign connecting with people because he hasn't had to relate to people like that. So I think you could say that the biggest hurdle in his campaign is his social class and the insulation that's provided him, which in a lot of ways has been a good thing in terms of comfort, but it's also put him in this bubble, and he doesn't have any idea how the rest of society works or how people interact with each other or they look at the world. He's not familiar with the cultural references. He says things like, well, I don't really know anything about NASCAR, but some of the NASCAR owners are my friends. Well, that right there is creating that division, and people at the upper income level, once again, I'm not really trying to make this political. Like I said, he's just somebody who's in the news right now. They live in a bubble.
To try to read into what you're saying, is that quality of life is hurt due to...
It's hard to say because they probably don't know that it's hurt. I would want a fuller life, where you meet different kinds of people. I like that, but not everybody does like that. So it's not for me to kind of put that on anybody.
Well, let's look statistically because they recently did the study where they found Denmark's the happiest country.
Right.
So if we do that for social classes, no study has been done, but as someone who is a professor on this topic, where would you say is the highest happiness? Is there a...
I don't know if there's a correlation there. I think it's probably, if you're poor, and I mean like poor, really poor, I think it's not that you can't be happy, but you've got a lot of struggles. Do you know what I mean? And that's tough. But once you get beyond that, once again, I'll go back to my kind of blue-collar guys that I play softball with. I think they're happy, and I think they're happy with the lives that they lead and the people that they interact with and the things that they have to do. So I don't know how to, I don't know that there's a correlation between either wealth and happiness or social class and happiness. There's a lot of pressure on you if you're in the upper class to the wealthy class to, I hate that term upper because I guess it works in income terms, but it kind of makes it sound better once again, which is exactly what we're trying to get around. But there's a lot of pressure, I would guess, to present yourself in a certain way. I don't think you're as free probably if you're in the, you're free financially, but in terms of kind of social restrictions on you, things are expected of you, and if you want to have long hair and wear a Cannibal Corpse shirt,
or a Death Angel shirt.
Or a Death Angel shirt. That sort of thing's frowned upon. And to be quite honest with you, that's why I do it, because I don't like the kind of cultural tags that I'm supposed to exhibit and how people sort of judge you as a result. I don't like playing that game, and I sort of go out of my way not to play it.
What are the negatives of social class?
It's divisive.
Is dividing wrong? Because we divide everything in life, and we do it for organizational purposes.
Somewhat, I just think it's human nature, too.
So are we supposed to fight human nature?
I'm convinced that if you stuck 4 people, in the woods and told them they had to survive, they'd break into 2 groups of 2 and fight with each other. But I don't know if that's really True or not? Lord of the Flies kind of thing. The problem with social class in this country is that it's, the word that I like to use is sticky. And if we're supposed to be an open, free, fair, democratic society, and the word that's often used is meritocratic, meaning where you get in society is based on your own merit, your own natural skill, and your own hard work. Well, we don't have that, and so in some ways it's a contradiction of what we're supposed to be. And so to use the word sticky again, you tend to be. There are things that keep you in place in the class environment that you're born into. It's not that you can't get out of it, but it's difficult. And that, once again, like I said, is a contradiction of what we're supposed to be about.
What perpetuates the idea that we're supposed to have this movement?
That's sort of what our country was founded upon. So that's what perpetuates it. If you were...
Well, who founded this country?
Rich white guys? Is that what you want me to...
I'm simply asking a question.
Well,
and I took a whole class on Ben Franklin. That didn't really help things.
Right. Yeah, wealthier white landowning guys, obviously.
I
don't think you want to be in a country where somebody who's really talented, but they're born poor and they don't have opportunities, can't take advantage of their talents and fulfill their potential, and they're stuck in some sort of poor environment because that's what they were born into, which happens all the time. Likewise, I don't think you want some flake who was lucky enough to be born to rich parents, doesn't work hard, doesn't do anything, just kind of flounders through life, but is able to stay in that category because his parents keep him in that category. And I know people like that where I'm from in California, and I find it really frustrating.
But
I think people are only willing to buy into the system that we have with its inequalities if they feel like everybody has a fair shot at either reaching the top or reaching the bottom. And I think people get frustrated when it looks like the deck is stacked in favor of certain people, and it clearly is pretty stacked in favor of certain people.
But it's been a long time since our country's been established.
Right.
What keeps this vision going that we're supposed to have this cultural movement?
You mean movement between classes?
Yes. Sorry, class movement.
No, that's okay. I just want to make sure I'm answering the right thing. Once again, I think it's part of the American dream that.
Well, what keeps perpetuating the American dream?
Well, I think if we don't have that, the whole thing falls apart. Then what's the point?
But what keeps the message going from generation to generation? Because Lord knows I didn't see my parents. I was a latchkey kid.
Yeah. It's certainly in pop culture and in the media.
Where is it in the media? Where do you see it in the media?
Where do I see what specifically?
This idea that class movement is going to happen, the American dream. Where do you see the American dream perpetuated in American Hollywood media?
I don't know. The Cosby Show popped into my mind for some reason. You're probably too young for that. Do you remember the Cosby Show?
I know the Cosby Show.
Okay, successful black family in where were they? Philadelphia. And wasn't she a lawyer and he was a doctor? And what does that say to people? Given that statistically that would have been fairly rare at the time. What are we? 25 years ago. And it would be still pretty statistically rare now, but it says to people, it gives an image to people of this is what you can aspire.
So going off of those statistics, is there some mathematical fact to the organization of peoples where before we were attempting to argue that class was just a philosophical, cultural idea?
I don't know, mathematical formula it might not be that precise.
In the idea that we can quantify the number of people who are within a certain tax bracket or income bracket, and that there are certain people of this certain kind living in a certain area that make this amount of money or that have this kind of employment. versus the cultural idea that we were talking about initially?
Well, you try to get the two to overlap as much as possible. Once you have an idea what you're talking about, then you try to figure out how to measure it as best you can, and that's where sometimes the income numbers can be misleading. There's more to class than income numbers.
Okay.
And that's where occupational categories might be more relevant.
Okay. Are there any positives to social class?
My short answer would be no. I guess
Well, the argument I've always heard is that it creates competition, which creates ingenuity, which creates new products, and it gives us something to strive for.
Well, and you do right, and you do see that in our society. That's sort of the argument made in favor of the American model. But I've never had anybody sort of explain to me in a satisfactory way how this, competition is supposed to transform into a harmonious society. I mean, there's a disconnect between competition and community.
Well, does it have to be harmonious?
Well, I think we want it to be, and if it's not, then.
But if it's harmonious, then we lose the competition, then we lose the ingenuity, then we lose the things that.
Well, right, then it all falls apart again, right? So
Yeah.
you kind of need everybody on the same page, and so I think you perpetuate this myth that that the game is fair, because if it's not fair, then nobody wants to play it, and then things fall apart. I mean, there are all kinds of, I think, interesting things going on with wealthy people and their unwillingness to pay taxes. What does that say about their sort of commitment to this community that our country is supposed to become? I'll be quite honest, and sometimes, and this is, sort of a patronizing, perhaps, question for me to even ask as, a white guy from my social background, but sometimes I wonder why people from certain minority groups, or more particularly people from certain income ranges, and for our purposes of our conversation, class brackets, are as patriotic as they are. This country isn't giving them a fair shake, and I don't understand why I think people aren't aware of it, number one, but if they were, I don't think they would be so kind of willing to go along with the system. And
Well, why aren't they aware of it? Is there something that's blinding them?
Yeah, and I mean, there are a lot of things. You mentioned race at the beginning. This is where I think focus on race becomes counterproductive, because we tend to look at race differences and not look at class differences. I remember even before I went to grad school, I had this job where I worked for the Nielsen television ratings, and I had to go around to different people's houses in different neighborhoods all over Southern California and in Hawaii also, both very diverse places, and so you meet all kinds of different people. And I was always struck by the fact that people of the same kind of job, I had this one guy in Anaheim, not too far from Disneyland or where the Angels play, who was a painter, and he's the most racist guy you'd ever meet based on the stuff that he said. But then it also came out that he had these 3 or 4 guys they worked with, and I think one or two of them was Mexican, and one of them was black, and they were like his buddies. Do you know what I mean? But he had this stuff in his head, and so it's like, and I'm thinking, well, this guy has much more in common with people who have similar jobs than him from different races than he has with somebody who also happens to be white, but is a doctor or a lawyer and lives down where I live in Irvine, 20 minutes away. So I mean, people get stuck on the race thing, but it's really the class thing that matters.
Okay. So.
And and I think wealthy people have figured this out. I mean, black or Latino or Indian or Pakistani or whatever doctor, they're going to hang out with white or Asian doctors. They're not going to look for other, let's say, Indian people who paint houses just because they're Indian. Do you know what I mean? The wealthy people sort of get it, and they hang out based on class, and a lot of times, once again, careful with this term, lower classes on the social hierarchy, I think, tend to divide themselves. They let race be a division instead of class, and I think that's counterproductive.
What would the world be without social class?
A better place.
How so?
It would be, once again, just from a philosophical point of view, we can come up with all kinds of contexts to put this in, but certainly in the context in which our country is supposed to operate. If where you were born, what your parents did for a job had little or ideally no impact on what you were going to be, and you went to sort of an equivalent school, we all went to public schools, and good public schools, and kids from poor families went to the same school and got the same education as kids from rich families, and advanced based on their merits, and then when they finished school and it was time to go get a job, they got jobs based on their merits, and everybody could, like I said, meritocracy. People ended up in society I don't mean necessarily where they should, but where they end up in society is based on their own talents and their own hard work, and other things, their ambition and their willingness to take risks. Certainly that matters in an entrepreneurial society, things like that. But that's what determines where you are, instead of all this stuff that's tied into who your parents are.
Would you want to live in that world?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
Not a problem. Thank you, Sean.
All right.